Thank you, Karen. Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be with you today, and I'm happy that you've taken a few minutes of your time to have this conversation. Those of you, I looked at the list of those attending, and there are a few of you that I know, and that is a good thing to have people that you know at least sign up to come hear the conversation. And I'm just thrilled to see so many people that have signed up. To give you just a little bit of background information on who I am and why I'm interested in this topic and what I've done through the years on it. My first half of my educational career was as a university administrator. I did that through the vice president level at the college and university realm. I then became head of school at 2 different boarding schools, and the last 8 years I've been the president of SAIS, a regional accrediting association affiliated with NAIS and the Commission on Accreditation, and the associations that many of your schools belong to were a peer association to that. Throughout that time in the school world, in the university world, I started as an admissions director, worked my way through as Associate Vice Chancellor of Enrollment Management, and then Vice President of Student Affairs. And then when I became head of school in the boarding school realm, both of the schools that I moved to were in need of growth. And so admissions enrollment was a very, very important aspect of both of those jobs. And so through the years, through the last 3 decades, I've been thinking a lot about enrollment, about admissions, and 2 years ago I was asked by a board of one of our large schools in the South to present on the topic of tuition elasticity, something that I had thought about but had never really put together a presentation on. And so what we're going to talk about today grows out of that, and hopefully it will be worthwhile. As you know, on webinars I will go through this fairly quickly, and there is no feedback, which we all prefer to have in a live presentation, have people giving feedback, but there's no feedback at this point. So just write your questions down, as Karen said, and we'll be happy to try to answer them at the end. Also, right up front, I will share with you that if anything that comes up is of concern to you, you want to talk about further, you want to push back, you want to ask more questions, we're happy to do that not only in the chat box that we can potentially have the questions available at the end, but I will be available to anyone that wants to discuss this further via email or even a phone call at some point in the not too distant future. I will say, in wrapping up about who I am and what brings me here, I leave SAIS as the president on June 30 after 8 years, and in mid-July I'm moving to Honduras, where I will become the canon for education for the Episcopal Diocese of Honduras, working with the 7 bilingual schools and 4 orphanage schools, and hopefully build a university at some point in Honduras. So my life's about to change a little bit, but I hope that many of you, we can stay engaged through the years and the coming years, and I will be back to a lot of the events, so I will continue to see you around. Anyway, with that in mind, we all know that on webinars, jokes fall flat because you can hear no one laugh, and cartoons fall flat. So let me just wish you all a Feliz Cinco de Mayo. My favorite holiday outside of the U.S. holidays is Cinco de Mayo. And so I hope you all have a wonderful Cinco de Mayo and enjoy a celebration of some kind today. Okay, on with the presentation of tuition elasticity. Independent school people have been struggling with setting tuition for many, many years. The board, one of the ways that the board is to fund a school is to set tuition and to set it in a thoughtful way and intelligently. One of the concerns we've had over the past few years is whether or not enrollment will be impacted if we raise tuition. There have been a number of debates that have taken place, particularly since 2008, when the economy went south. People worried about whether or not raising tuition, which we felt like we needed to do, and we did indeed need to raise tuition, was going to impact enrollment in our schools, and at what point there might be a ceiling for raising tuition. When we talk about this, let's do a little Stat 101 refresher on correlation, because I know you've all been exposed to this. But what we're really talking about when we think in those terms is simply a two-variable model. If we raise tuition, is enrollment impacted? And you remember that a positive correlation is one in which when tuition increases, enrollment would increase. Now, that would be a great problem if that's what we were worried about, but that is not really what we're most concerned about. What we're concerned about is whether or not there's a negative correlation, or when tuition increases, enrollment decreases. And it's been said by many who have looked at the data over the last several years that, in fact, there is no correlation between tuition and enrollment. When you take those two variables, there's no correlation between that. And that makes sense on one hand to me, but at the same time, there are some concerns that I have with that. A large group of some 5,000 schools were looked at the correlation between these two variables, and it was determined in one study in the not too distant past that there was zero correlation. I think there are other things for us to think about on this equation, and that's what we're going to do in this presentation. Before we get specifically into the elasticity conversation, let's look at some current realities for independent schools. Over the last 30 years, between 1984 and 2013, tuition increased at about 4 times the rate of household income. Now, the graph you see in front of you represents SAIS tuition in our schools, and we serve just shy of 400 schools in SAIS, so we're not the same data set that you would find with NAIS, and we have a couple of different data sets that I'll work from, but the one that I can get the data from and that I have the data on immediately is what you see in front of you on this graph. So slightly over 4 times the rate of household income increase. John Chubb has mentioned that NAIS is less than this, somewhere in the 3s, but either way, we have had tuition nationally outpacing household income, and that is one of the realities that we need to look at. Another reality is this, that what it takes for a family to show up on one of the financial analysis forms as a full pay family. Now, hopefully we're all engaged in helping those in lower socioeconomic groups attend our schools regardless of their ability to pay, and some of your schools are able to do this more than others. But the reality is that the way independent schools work, and being funded primarily by tuition revenue, we need to bring in a sufficient number of full pay families. Now, what you see in this graph in front of you, on the left side are school tuitions. These were numbers run for me by NAIS or SSS by NAIS using their methodology for this year. The numbers on the left are the lower school, middle school, upper school, and boarding school averages for SAIS schools. The NAIS numbers are slightly more than this, but the principle of this still holds true. And for a family with one child, 2 parents and 1 child in an independent school, full pay doesn't kick in until $126,000 in household income in lower school at a tuition of $14,000. When your tuition is closer to $20,000, you will see that with 1 child in school, it's closer to $150,000 in household income in order to be represented as full pay by the needs analysis. And if they have 2 children in school, you can see the number there. Another way I like to look at this is just the difference between full need and full pay. At what level does a typical family show up on a needs analysis as unable to pay even $1, to need full need? Now, I recognize that all schools do not meet full need. Some of you do, many of you do, but all of you don't. But to get the needs analysis to show up as full need, we're talking roughly $65,000 regardless of the school tuition amount. On the other hand, when you start looking at full pay, the lowest full pay, and some of you are looking at that $5,000 tuition and thinking there's no way there's an independent school that has that. There are a few in some parts of our country, completely independent schools that charge in that range. But you're still looking at nearly a $90,000 household income to reach the full pay, all the way up again to roughly $150,000 for a $20,000 tuition. So I asked a question of my friends and colleagues at SSS. I said, give me an ability to pay floor, a number below which a family will never show an ability to pay anything for for tuition. They will always show up as a full need family. What is that floor and what is the situation for it? And we found that for one parent and one child and the child in school, the floor would be $47,085. So theoretically, roughly $47,000, a household income below that will always show up as a full need family when they apply for financial aid in our schools. Okay, again, sticking to some pictures that help us understand it. I like pictures, help me understand it. But let's take a look at a graph of full need, the window of partial pay, and the full pay window. Again, the 150 you see there is an average, and that's for one child. Many of your schools, your tuitions are such that it will be more than that. Some of you may be a little less than that, and when you factor in 2 children, it's going to be considerably more than that, close to $200,000 to reach the full pay level. So what we're looking at here on this graph is just showing a range of household incomes in a rough sense. I know it's not exact, but in a rough sense. And by the way, all of you can get from your from the company that provides your needs analysis, they can give you these exact numbers for your schools, with the cost of living adjustments, with your tuitions, and so on and so forth. They can give you the numbers we're talking about here that I'm just using some rough averages on. But what we have is we have 65,000 is full need roughly, 150,000 is where full pay kicks in, and there's a large range of partial pay. With that said, let's look at also what the household incomes in the latest census represent. The median household incomes by region in the United States, 55,958 in the West to 48,731 in the South. So if you will notice, the median household incomes are pretty close to that $50,000 mark. If you notice this graph, it also breaks it out by race. And this is something that should be very important to us because I think most of our schools are very interested in being appropriately diverse to represent the communities that we're in. So a couple more pictures to look at to give you an idea of what we're talking about and why the question's being asked. In 1984, an AIS upper school tuition on average consumed about 22% of the U.S. median household income. In 2013, upper school tuition in an AIS school on average would represent about 44% of the U.S. median household income. Going back to the slide we just looked at, let's slice it up by percentile on household incomes in the U.S. What we're looking at is a median household income in the U.S. is still below, nearly $14,000 below where full need ends. And you all remember from your Stat 101 class what the median 50th percentile means. Half of the population is below that, half of the households are below that, and half above. If you look at the 60th percentile, roughly where full need ends, we're looking at about 60% of the households in the U.S. are already pretty much priced out of the independent school market based on this understanding of ability to pay and what our tuitions are. 80th percentile is still coming in right in the middle of partial pay. 90th percentile for some schools, a lot of schools will pick up full pay at about the 90th percentiles, but most of our schools nationally are living somewhere in the top 5% of household incomes when they're recruiting and looking for full pay students. So with that said, let's talk about elasticity. Elasticity is simply demand's reaction to price. We probably have some of you on the line that could give this lesson much better than I. We have folks with economics degrees or spend a lot more time on this, but very simply put, it's just what does demand for a product do when prices raise? An elastic situation is when price goes up, demand goes down. That's the elastic that we're most concerned with. And by the way, it's also elastic when price goes up, demand goes up, because demand reacts to price. Some luxury goods this occurs for, but it's not what we're primarily concerned with. And the inelastic effect of price is simply if price goes up, demand does not change. And so the question at hand is whether or not, if we raise tuition, or at what level can we raise tuition and make sure we're not hurting demand, is it elastic or is it inelastic? Okay, to get at that question, the answer to that question, let's look at something very quickly. Let's look at how the enrollment decision happens with your schools. Now, I think all of you will say, of course, that's the kind of thing that I work with all the time, and I certainly understand that. But there are essentially three things that go in to a family making an enrollment decision. And I will say this, what my assumption is here is that the family that we're talking about is one that finds their values or their motivations are in line with your mission. So a family comes in, looks at your school, wants to enroll in your school. There are really three things that interact here to make that enrollment decision. The first is the ability to pay. Second, competing values, and value differential. Ability to pay is simply the ability to write the check that you ask them to write. So if you're giving them financial aid, for my definition here, can they write whatever is left over in the tuition payment? Can they write the check you ask them to write? So a family that's full need has ability to pay because you're not asking, or full need and you meet that need, might be considered having ability to pay because they are not asked to pay anything. On the other hand, if you give someone half financial aid or tuition discounting in your $20,000 school, can they write the $10,000 check? That's the ability to pay. Ability to pay typically comes from discretionary W-2 income, what families bring home in their salaries and their paycheck. Also comes from family financial reserves as a rule. The other resources, I know that the previous president of NAIS and good friend and mentor of mine, Pat Bassett, I used to hear him say that it was estimated roughly 30% of our students in our schools had all or part of their tuition paid by grandparents. And you will not always know that because sometimes grandparents will write the check to their child who in turn will write it to you. And then ability to pay is impacted by financial aid. So that is a variable ability to pay. The value differential is simply the difference between the perceived value of your school and the perceived value of the alternative school. And for this argument, let's think of the alternative being the public school that does not charge tuition. So in reality, this equation could work for all kinds of alternative schools that families would consider. But let's focus on the fact we're talking about your school and the value you bring versus the public school that is no cost to the family by way of tuition. And that value differential is the other factor there. You also have competition for families' discretionary income, competing values. Many of the things that compete for tuition dollars, we would consider them wholesome and valuable. Family vacations, who would argue against that being worthwhile for families? Sometimes it's bigger homes, sometimes it's travel baseball or hockey or travel sports for their child or whatever. But families have competing values, things they value that will compete for the discretionary dollars. So if we look at it in the form of an equation, I would suggest that the enrollment for a family that wants to be in your school and has found a match with their motivations and your mission, there's an equation that would look something like this: the ability to pay times the perceived value of your school minus the combined perceived value of the alternative and the competing values equals the likelihood to enroll. And for those of you that prefer a picture, it would look something like this. Forgive me just a second. I have to get a drink of water. It would look something like this. For a family that has no ability to pay, there's 0 on this scale. It doesn't matter how great the value differential is. And this is very unfortunate. It breaks our heart. And it's very unfortunate. But they cannot enroll in our school because we've asked them to pay an amount if they cannot pay it. On the other hand, if you have individuals, and I always use Bill Gates as the example, if Bill Gates is a parent in your school or wants to enroll his child in your school, the value difference, you just need to be a little better than the alternative to get someone where your tuition is really not an impact on their finances. So what we're really looking at is the greater the ability to pay, the smaller the value differential can be and still get the enrollment. On the other hand, the less the ability to pay, the greater that value differential needs to be to get an enrollment. So factors that impact tuition elasticity are value differential, ability to pay, competing values, and motivation compatibility. And let's look at it this way. Again, the value differential is how families perceive your value in compared to the alternative, and it must be a positive perception. Again, I'm insulting the intelligence of everyone on the line because that makes perfectly good sense. On the other hand, if you look at that from an elastic standpoint, the greater or the higher your value differential, the more inelastic your tuition will be. In other words, for a family that sees a tremendous value difference between coming to your school, sending their children to your school, and sending their children to the local public school, your raising tuition is not going to impact them nearly as much as the family that only sees a slight value differential. So getting back to what we talked about earlier at the first of this with the simple linear regression model of tuition and enrollment, this is a multivariate issue, and the first variable that I would argue comes into play is that of value differential. By the way, I'm not making a claim that the variables I'm talking about are exhaustive. There are a lot of people on the line, a lot of people thinking about this, a lot of people that are a lot smarter than I am and have probably spent more time thinking about it. And so there may be other things. The main argument I'm making is there are multiple variables that come into play here. And value differential is going to be a major one. And by the way, the one that I think a school has the greatest ability to impact in a family's perception. Okay, let's look at the ability to pay. So we're looking at inelastic again, whether you can raise tuition and the demand will not change all the way to elastic. And let's think of ability to pay looking something like this graph. If you were to chart the families in your school based on what the needs analysis shows as full need and what it shows as full pay, and where those families fall on that list. For a family, again, where their resources are so great that your tuition is really not significant to them, their income is at a very high level, they're going to probably start approaching an inelastic point and will theoretically reach an inelastic point for tuition where you can raise tuition whatever you want to raise it. Because it's not going to impact them. On the other end of the continuum, for the full need family, assuming full need is met, so this only takes into consideration for those of your schools that meet the full need. For the full need family, tuition is inelastic. They don't care what you raise tuition to because they have tuition discounting, remission, financial aid, whatever the terms you use, to cover that need. Where a school needs to really be concerned on this ability to pay variable are those families that are somewhere in the middle of the partial pay window. And those, particularly as they start to approach full pay, I don't know exactly whether this curve represents the exact distribution, but I have a very good sense that it would look something like this. There are going to be families just into the full pay category that tuition will be more elastic for, and there will be a lot of families at the middle to upper end of the partial pay window where you might find tuition on this variable alone, ability to pay, is much more elastic, and families are much less willing to deal with tuition increases of any kind of substantial scale. And indeed, we may be approaching some limits in that area. So if you think of it that way, there's another variable that goes in the equation, ability to pay. Competing values, we've talked about that before, where the families, all of our families have competing values, and the fewer competing values they have, the more inelastic the tuition. The more competing values they have, the more elastic the tuition would be in these terms. We mentioned earlier motivations of families, and when I talk about the value or the enrollment decision and how that decision is made by families, as I stated then, it's always assuming that the motivation that brought the family in and the mission of the school are compatible, and we're talking about a family that is sitting in front of you wanting to enroll. That's how the decision is able to be made. But we really have to pay attention to what it is that motivates families to even consider independent schools. So when we're looking beyond those who are coming in our door asking us to enroll or applying, those families that are not coming in our door that we would like to attract, what are the motivations that we're working with at that point? 2011, NAIS commissioned this parent motivation survey. For all of you who are NAIS members, it would be available to you. I believe it's still posted on the website as a PDF for members to look at. And I won't go into all the details of this study, but what they really wanted to find out is for families that were defined as high-income families, theoretically on average able to support a child or children in an independent school. They wanted to know what really motivated them to choose an independent school or not choose an independent school. After a three-tiered approach to the study, starting with a focus group and then a couple of surveys, the analysis was that and for this study, they classified parents into 5 different types. And if you'll see the graph in front of you, or the chart in front of you, the light green are families that would definitely consider independent schools, would definitely seek out independent schools. The kind of violet color is probably, the turquoise color is might or might not, the blue is probably not, and definitely not is the kind of a gold color. So the 5 categories that families were categorized into were parents who push, success-driven parents, special kids parents, character-building parents, and public school proponents. And I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but essentially parents who push are focused on ensuring that their children get a high-quality education and a challenging curriculum at a reasonable cost. They tend to have their children in public schools currently, but they are not necessarily satisfied with those schools. Success-driven parents want to provide an education that will help their kids get into top-tier colleges and be successful in life. Half of these parents currently have children in independent schools and half children in public schools, but are willing to consider independent schools. Special kids parents are searching for schools that can address their children's unique learning or behavioral issues. Their child has a special situation. It could be a particular talent or gift as well. And most of these students end up in public schools, but parents would really like to consider independent schools. And so many of our schools that serve students with special gifts or learning differences might find themselves attracting a lot of those parents. Character-building parents want more than just great academics. They want their child to develop strong moral character. This group is likely to send their children, they're most likely to send their children to independent schools. And then the public school proponents just believe it's everyone's civic responsibility to support their local public schools, and they believe that parent involvement can overcome some of the public school problems. So if we think of, and by the way, these are primary motivations. All families, all parents have multiple motivations, but as primary motivations, that's what the study's getting at, and it's all we can address here. But if you think of those groups of parents and motivations, if we can extrapolate this to our schools broadly, it would be understood that independent schools are made up of approximately 40% of the parents could be classified based on the definition of this study as being success-driven parents, 30% character-building parents, and that's because it's a smaller overall piece of the pie, although a higher percentage of character-building parents would consider independent schools. And if your school has a special mission serving students with special needs or special gifts, the special kid parent will probably make up a large portion of your school. But as you can see, public school proponents and even parents who push, by and large, are not the families that come and seek out our schools. Again, if we can take this data and apply it to our schools. So with that said, we have yet another variable. The variable in elastic to inelastic is related to the motivation of the parent, what motivates them to come to your school. If you happen to get a public school proponent as a parent family in your school, you tweak tuition slightly, it might be quite elastic, and you might find yourself, or they might find themselves deciding we can go on to the public schools. However, for the character-building parents and success-driven parents, by way of motivation, the likelihood is they're going to the tuition for them on that variable would be much more inelastic. So with that said, I propose here 4 variables that will impact the elasticity of tuition for your schools. The reason that I said early on that when we were talking about the correlations that didn't answer all the question is because so often to this point the discussion on is tuition going to impact enrollment has been a simple linear regression, a simple 2-variable equation or a correlation model. Does tuition impact enrollment? Well, it depends. In some places it will, and in some places it won't, depending on your community and depending on what it is that motivates your parents to be there, depending on a number of factors. So, with that said, if you have all of your families that love what you do and think education is great, they all have a money machine in their basement, and or your endowment is really strong and your public schools are really bad, you're in great shape. Your school's in great shape. You're probably very inelastic. You can raise tuition and it's not going to affect your enrollment much at all. But for the rest of the schools, things that you should consider. When you get at the information that you will need as a school and as leaders in your schools to really impact the enrollment situation and manage the enrollment. I talk about enrollment in our schools almost exclusively in enrollment management terms. I don't talk other than just to make a point with people that would understand the terms. I don't really like to talk as much about admissions and financial aid and a lot of the other things in the terms we use for years. I like to talk about managing the enrollment. But to manage the enrollment takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of research, and you have to understand some things. You have to understand your community demographics. You have to know the number of school-age children in your community. In a lot of communities, I'm studying in Georgia. Our office is in Atlanta, Georgia, and that's where I live for the time being. But in Georgia, there is a tremendous growth expected in school-age children over the next decade. And a lot of people that were thinking in terms of this is going to be great, we're going to have a lot more school-age kids, until they found out that the growth is all happening in families below the median household income. So the growth in numbers of children doesn't necessarily mean greater potential for your school for enrollment. So understanding the number of school-age children, financial capacities, employment opportunities, what big employers are coming in, which ones are leaving, and so on and so forth are things that you need to know to put all of these, to put this equation together for your school. Competition. What are the public schools like? How is the charter school legislation in your state, and how is that impacting enrollment? Are more of your families getting involved in homeschooling now that they can deliver curriculum online, virtual schools, low-cost privates, other independent schools? You need to understand your competition through and through, and not just the other schools like you, like your school, that are down the road. And then you also need to understand your school's programs and the fit that it has for the families and the motivation. I think it's important to manage reputation. I've often said that it's better that everyone outside the gates of your school wish they could be inside and think you're great than for everyone outside of your gates to think it's just a bunch of rich kids in there that we wouldn't want to be a part of. Reputation is very important. But with that said, let me make a suggestion to you. All of you, I believe the one area, first off, enrollment management takes a lot of work, and understanding how elastic the tuition is at your school takes a lot of work and research. But the one area that we can do more to ensure our sustainability and enrollment, and quite honestly, I don't think enough schools are paying attention to, is increasing the perceived value of your school. If you look at all of the other variables, the ability to pay, you can't impact that too much more for the students in your school. I mean, you can impact it through financial aid, but we all have limits there. Okay, we're not going to necessarily change the motivation of parents coming in, and we're also not really going to influence competing values, but what we can influence is the understanding of values for us and for our schools. So I suggest that perfecting the value narrative is a very important piece of this discussion. And what I mean by your value narrative, what it is that really makes your school great. How can we create a narrative that lets people know and lets family know how that our mission and who we are matches up with their motivations and what they value. Now, within this narrative, you're going to have multiple voices. All of you that do admissions understand this very well because you deal with it every day. But you're going to have a parent voice. So when you're talking about the wonderful things of the school, or when you're telling your story, the pieces that you will tell parents is all a part of the same narrative, but will often be different than the pieces of the story that you will tell donors, or the part of the story that you will tell students when you're talking to them. And then there's even a public voice of your value narrative that needs to be understood and needs to be addressed. So I would suggest to you that once you understand all of the variables that are impacting your school's financial sustainability, enrollment sustainability, and the elasticity of tuition, and you understand it as that multivariate model of correlations rather than just the simple correlation with the two variables, that the way you can impact your enrollment and your sustainability to the greatest level is get your head around the value narrative and to perfect that value narrative. And I've got one more slide I'm going to show you, and then I will stop my rapid talk, and hopefully there'll be some questions. But this is something that I recommend when I work with school boards or work with administrative teams, which is where I get to spend most of my time working in schools, is that it doesn't have to be four quadrants like this graph in front of you, but just graph on one axis what it is that families value, what value they're trying to see accomplished, achieved, satisfied by enrolling in your school. And on the other, put the performance of how well your school performs on those areas of value that families have. And what I would suggest, when you start to think in terms of your value narrative, you're going to find that your value narrative exists in the quadrant where families value what you do at a very high level, and you are also very good at it. That's where your story comes from to increase and enhance the perceived value of families that walk in the door. Now, when I'm dealing primarily at the board level or even administrative level, we talk a lot about this. If you want to know where your strategic initiatives will come from, what's going to populate your strategic plan for the next few years to make an impact on, I would suggest it's the areas that families value at a very high level and you're not performing at the same high level that is expected. And that's where your strategic initiatives come from. This quadrant right here, these are the distractions. We all know that schools have a very difficult time cutting loose programs that they've had for a long time, and particularly when they're really good. If you've got a really amazing program, it's real difficult to ever accept the fact that maybe people don't care about that program anymore and to make those kinds of cuts as they might be necessary. And I'm not talking about mission central programs here. If you're a faith-based school, you're not going to do away with your faith-based celebrations that you might maintain at your school just because people don't rate them highly. But you can be very distracted. And one other thing, going back to that first chart we saw on tuition outpacing or tuition outpacing household incomes, The most likely causes for that I have heard and that I understand is one, that for schools, technology has been pretty much additive over the last couple of decades. We've been adding computers, unlike for businesses, and they're not making us necessarily more productive or saving us money. A business doesn't add technology unless it makes them money or saves them money. But we've been adding technology to teach children. It's been additive. But the other thing is that the teacher-to-student ratios over the last 30 years have remained pretty constant. The administrator-to-student ratios have almost increased 4 times. And it's because we add programs and we don't ever consider what programs are no longer serving us. So, and then the last one are the hindrances, the places that schools can really be hindered, because not only does no one care about what you're doing, you're no good at it. And for the CFOs on the line and those of you that deal with the money, this is where you lick your chops, because virtually every school I've ever seen could find something in these categories. So we've had a very quick run through a discussion on enrollment, and it all ties in with the tuition elasticity question that's being asked over and over again. And hopefully this has given you some things to think about. Again, I welcome your input, even past any questions that we have the ability to take on the air in just a few minutes. I welcome your emails. I welcome any input that you have for me. Welcome pushback. If you disagree with something, let's have a conversation, because we can all be better as we learn. I always appreciate being proven wrong, because when I'm proven wrong, I always learn something that I thought was different. So I welcome any of that. So with that said, Karen, I'm going to stop rambling here, and we will take questions as you see fit.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was a great presentation. I actually do have several questions here, so we'll just get started. We have about 10 more minutes before the end of the allotted time. So the first question is, when you're looking at the correlation between tuition and demand, are you breaking enrollment type down into full pay and financial aid? It seems like that could make a difference.
Yeah, and what in the analysis that I was working with, I was not differentiating at that level, but when you add the variable ability to pay, that's where it's introduced into the multiple variable equation. So that's why I argued that to only look at enrollment and counting heads and what your tuition is doing by way of increase is not a sufficient model. You have to factor in the ability to pay, which in my definition is impacted by how much financial aid is given to a family and their need. So it definitely comes into play, and that was the ability to pay variable that, for my understanding at least, assumes that factor in the equation.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, if demand is more inelastic at a higher price point, then raising tuition will increase tuition revenue by definition of elasticity. If this is true, at what point on the demand curve does it become more elastic or beneficial to lower tuition?
Well, the point that I really wanted to get across today was that the answer that I like to give when I'm live and then just smile at people and see their reaction is, the answer is it depends. And what that means is really that every school has to understand their circumstance around this question. And then the mission and the philosophy of the school, the philosophy of the board that they establish for the school to meet the mission of the school is very, very important here. And I would suggest that, you know, just because you can raise tuition and your demand doesn't lessen, doesn't necessarily mean you should raise tuition. it has to be filtered through the lens of what you're trying to accomplish as a school, the mission you're trying to accomplish, and so on and so forth. What we generally think is that the more tuition that you legitimately can support, and to raise it to a level that you can support, and like anything else that's of a higher price, it has to have the quality to back it up, or it crumbles. It crumbles later. But we've generally thought, if we're leaving money on the table but not charging enough, why don't we go ahead and charge what it really costs to educate children and take the additional revenue and maybe do some more discounting? That's where I personally fall, just to give you my personal idea, although there are a lot of people as smarter than I am in this area that would have a different opinion. But I would suggest we probably should work toward trying to charge for tuition, set a tuition sticker price at what it really costs to educate a child, which is simply our operating budget divided by the number of children in the school. That may be overly simplistic, but if we think of it in those terms, right now I think nationally, at least in SAIS numbers, somewhere around 92% of the revenue supporting operating budgets in our schools come from tuition, and depending on endowment earnings and annual funds and everything else, the rest of it's made up in other ways. So I would be inclined to set tuition at what it really costs to educate a child, and then use more toward financial aid if needed. But that's a different opinion. Different people have different opinions on that. So yeah, in theory, there are a lot of your schools, and I saw some of the schools on the list. There are a number of you folks that could raise your children and get that. So it has to be an individual school decision with the philosophy, with the mission, and with all of those variables that interact with your community.
Okay, thank you, Steve. We're getting a little bit of feedback on your audio, just FYI. The next question is, does tuition work the same for full pay families and for families who receive aid, which assumes that both sets of families are paying what's asked of them, whether that's all or part of the tuition?
Right. Yeah. The decision that families make really, in a variable that I didn't put in here because it's really hard to get your hands around and to quantify in any important way, is the ability or the willingness of a family to sacrifice, to pay that which isn't easy to pay, or to modify their values for those competing values and do less in other areas. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, it gets down to the fact families are taking money they have access to, whether it be their discretionary earnings or their discretionary monies left from their paychecks, or whether it be reserves or whatever it might be. And they're having to make a decision to make a purchase of a school tuition. So yes, it impacts all families alike. The only ones that well, like I said, the only two kind of extremes where the elasticity question really doesn't come into play are those families that you are meeting full need or full need plus, and they're not having to pay anything, and the families where that your tuition is just kind of pocket change to them because their wealth, their finances, financial resources are so great that it's really insignificant what you're asking. For those two groups, the elasticity question really doesn't come into play. It's other things. Are you the school that meets their motivation? Are you the one best for their child, and so on and so forth? But for virtually all of our families, at some level, the elasticity question will come into play, at least in my estimation.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes. I'm going to look at a couple of questions that we have here. One question, Steve, is do you know if anyone has looked at figuring out basically how to bring tuition back into line with current domestic family incomes? We noticed that those lines were very disparate in the one chart that you had. Is there anyone
Yes.
doing any work on getting tuitions back into line with income?
Well, there are a lot of people talking about it, and I talk a lot about it. The problem we have is that we really in our schools have a fairly simple financial structure compared to some, and I'm going to throw out some averages, and I know all the schools listening, people from schools listening, your schools don't meet this, but roughly we bring in 90% of our revenue in tuition, and roughly we spend 75%, 80% of our expenses go out into personnel costs. So it's, big chunk, two big chunks. We spend it in personnel and we bring it in tuition. So what I think most that I've talked with on this situation or this question would agree to, and this is where I am at this point in my thinking about it, is that what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to rethink the model that we have in our schools. And there are some exciting new possibilities on the horizon. I mentioned earlier that technology has been pretty much an additive cost for schools for the last couple of decades since we started adding computer labs. It's just been a big expense line item in our budgets, and we've spent a lot of money on that. There's reason to believe that through some blended learning models and some other things that are on the horizon, and some already coming into our schools, virtual laboratories and a few other things, that technology might start to be a cost saver for us in the future. And we might be able to start reducing that. The other thing is, I'm absolutely convinced, and I think a lot of folks that talk and think about this would agree, that we need to reshape our narrative around what it is that generates the quality in our schools. For many, many years, and I know many of you out there have already changed this narrative, but there are still a lot of independent schools that their narrative contains, or they do not dispel the narrative that someone else says related to them around the notion that it's small classes that bring quality. And I think the research is pretty clear that it's really excellent teachers that add to the quality of the learning experience for the child, and more so than small classes. There are very few people that I know that would take a class size of 13 to have their child in with an average teacher than to take a class size of 22 with a great teacher. Most would go for the great teacher with a little larger class. So we need to rethink class size where that's possible, but we need to think how technology can help bring our costs down. So I don't know that tuition will will go down, but I think there's some prospect for the tuition leveling off if we're smart and take advantage of some of the opportunities in front of 21st century schools.
Steve, thank you so much. I know that we do have several questions still sitting here waiting. We have kind of reached the end of our webinar time frame at this point. What I'd like to let you know is that if you still have a question that hasn't been answered by Steve, I am going to be sending him a transcript of the webinar. So your questions will be going to him, and he will also have your email address. His email address is also on the current slide, so please feel free also to send questions his way. He's very generous and offered to, talk to you about anything that you might have still kind of brewing in your head at this point. Once again, this webinar is being recorded. I probably will post this up on the admission.org website within a couple of days. As soon as that's up, I will send the link to that page to all registrants, so you'll get a link to the page as soon as that's completed. I want to thank everyone for tuning in, and a special thank you to Steve for providing us with such an insightful webinar. Have a great day, everyone, and thanks again.